No
let's
problem, thank you.
let's go to Shane Roberts, please.
Good evening, Mayor, councillors. I'm a resident of Capitol Hill. Good evening, Councillor Wong. Sitting there, I was excited to see this clock counting down because it reminded me of my days as a navigator on the CC-130 Hercules, which I'm going to bring in some of my experience that has to do with operational planning and risk assessment. During tactical airlift formations, when we would take off in formations of 3, it was my job as the navigator to set my clock to 30 seconds and wait for that 30-second gap so that we could start rolling after the lead ship. And during training, I missed my timing, and I was told by my instructor, you do that a second time, I have to fail you, and you'll be recoursed. So we're counting down, but you know what? Let's not rush to fail. Let's not do that. We just had a construction worker telling us what happens when we try to rush things. And I hope, with my background as a navigator and planning, that we're looking at the actual winds, because we're going into a headwind. We're going into the inner city. We're going into neighborhoods where infrastructure is reaching end of cycle, and there's not even data to tell us what it can handle when we densify by a factor of 8 in our CG. So I was trying to come up with an analogy. One thing I was told as a navigator when I was a second lieutenant in training at the Canadian Forces Air Navigation School in Winnipeg was I was rounding up or rounding down the winds on the forecast chart, which were symbols. And in that day, everything was done by hand and writing. And yes, we used sextants, and yes, I did 3-star fixes. We had to, by aviation law, in order to enhance the navigation as we went across the Atlantic with only a 1950s along and a cross-track computer and an INS or something else that was even less accurate. But the point is, he told me, Shane, don't be optimistic about the winds and don't be pessimistic. Write them down as you see them. And what are the winds in Altador? What are we being told anecdotally by a resident and by an expert in real estate? That we remove affordable rentable stock that was $1,800 a month for a basement suite, and now a family of 4 is being evicted because they won't be able to afford a rent of $3,500 after the developers put 2 infills that will go for $1.2 million. We go from $800,000 or $900,000 to $1.2 million. Those are the wins. Those are the actual wins. What's the entry level for a row house? $500,000. So we're dealing with some really important numbers. We have an entry level of $500,000, and we know the median income can afford $200,000. That's a huge deficit. And we're making some assumptions that have to do with the mysterious affordability piece. And as Councillor Waness mentioned the other day when we were looking at a linear graph of projected housing supply and increasing, she rightly asked, is there affordability layer in there? No, there isn't. The data isn't there. You don't have the forecast winds. Maybe we could look at the full data set from Auckland, New Zealand. I think we're being overly optimistic. We're going into headwinds, and we've got to consider the fact. And this isn't going to work in terms of creating housing supply, because as Peter Gao rightly pointed out, this is piecemeal, this is ad hoc. You don't have the scale as you roll into the inner city neighborhoods. And you're going to put more and more expensive homes into the hands of a select demographic who can afford them. And we also had an expert in real estate explain that when these properties appreciate, and if we do say yes to massive upzoning, I predict that overnight, the land values in the inner city will start appreciating. And the developers, they know this. So we're going into a headwind. We don't have reliable data. If we were doing that on a mission, if I was in a situation, maybe I'm in equatorial Africa trying to take off. We don't have diplomatic clearances to land in certain countries, so we have to carry a lot of extra fuel to hold what was called the alternate. What would I do? We would fill that aircraft to the gills. Tens of thousands of pounds of extra fuel because we're going into an unknown situation. So I recommend folks, that $232 million, you're going to need that extra fuel. Because whether you think of this as sufficient scale to somehow bring that $500,000 entry level down to $200,000, it's not going to happen. There's too many dampening effects. But let's say you did. You're going to do this in scale. Well, you're going to need blanket infrastructure repairs. And all I've seen on 17th Avenue Northwest to compensate for increases in density has been ad hoc piecemeal infrastructure, and that's going to be expensive. So my recommendation is take the money and put that in your tank. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your presentation. Let's go to Whitney.